I'm here with Sarah Peyton, who has agreed to offer a 3-day workshop on shame and privilege for Living Bridges at the end of April and the first 2 days of May. So thank you so much for being here, Sarah, and I'm really grateful to be talking to you about this.
I'm very happy to be here.
I'd love to know a little bit about your journey and what brought you to this point, to where you are now in your life, if you're willing to share.
Well, two things. One thing that brought me was my own relationship with shame, which was very intense and has remained very intense. My mom had really intense trauma when she was a little girl, and so that impacted her, and it impacted the way she parented and what it left me with, although it was not her intention, but what it did leave me with was just a ton of shame to work through. So that's been sort of my life journey. And then in addition, I had a wonderful adopted son who had terrible trauma when he was a little guy, and who in a way died of shame. He ended up trying to manage the terrible flashbacks from his trauma by drinking, and by the end of his life had stopped eating food altogether and just sort of disappeared into and died in alcohol. So losing him also speaks to me of the fatality and the seriousness of shame. It's not just some little thing like an annoyance or something. It's a big thing for our mammalian bodies. We need healing from shame, and working with this subject of privilege is almost impossible unless we address a number of different kinds of shame are important when we're working with privilege, because we often have contracts that make us not want to even turn toward looking at the truth of the world and the ways in which it is unequal.
Yeah. Thank you for speaking to those pieces in your journey. It also speaks to me about how relatable that is. That's such a common thread. Parents who are dealing with their own trauma and then not quite knowing how to hold that inside of themselves, inadvertently, with the best that they have, still passing it on to their children. And in a way, it almost sounds like what you're offering with shame and privilege is about breaking some of those cycles, or not maybe addressing them. I'm not sure breaking is too intense a word for it, but
yeah, addressing them, releasing them, maybe.
Releasing them.
Yeah.
Could you say a bit more about shame itself, and as you understand it, how would you conceptualize it?
I see it in a couple different ways. It's what happens to our nervous system when we experience being excluded or being blamed, or excluding ourselves or blaming ourselves. It's a mammalian response to, in a way, to being abandoned by ourselves, or to being abandoned by others. We usually think that we're to blame with the shame cycles, and we don't realize that they are a natural response to alarmed aloneness, to being left alone. When people blame us, they leave us alone. They turn away from us. When people have contempt for us, they're divorcing themselves from us, and we're left terribly alone.
It's almost like a natural human response to aloneness or separation or alienation.
Yeah, it's very most basic positive intent is to provide us with the information we need to be able to find our way back into connection. But that presupposes that the system isn't traumatized, and most systems are traumatized.
Yeah. And I guess one other aspect of that then, as you say, it would also be that when we blame ourselves or we're shaming ourselves, we are leaving ourselves alone.
Yes.
A deeper degree of alienation, almost a
Yeah.
separation
Yeah.
from something fundamental inside of me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm hearing you refer to systems and nervous systems, and I know that a lot of what you bring to the table has to do with neuroscience, and I'm wondering, how do you bring that into this space with NVC and shame and privilege? How would that how would you bring it in?
Well, the way that helps the most is to kind of have an understanding of ourselves as mammals and what our bodies, what our primate bodies do with different information. And then we can begin to have compassion for our bodies and for our cells, that they have responses. One of the interesting ones that people rarely think about is the phenomenon of precedence, where it's important to the cells of our bodies who got here first. And our bodies relax when that is acknowledged. So if I'm somebody's teacher, for example, and I go to their workshop and they don't acknowledge that I was their teacher, there's something that's uncomfortable. Like I was the teacher first. Or it can happen with friendship, you know, that people have a sense of like, hey, I was the first friend. I was a friend before that person. And there can be this, it almost feels like a funny, there's shame elements to it. And it feels like a funny violation of some order, but we don't know what it is because we never think about that being important to our mammalian bodies. But that's a wonderful example of a way in which neuroscience can help us to see ourselves with compassion as we have our just sort of normal responses to the world.
Yeah, because when you said the piece about friendship, I have complete memories of feeling quite left out when suddenly two friends start getting along, and I'm like, I was there first. What about me?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And the normal response to this, the standard response I have from anybody else when I say this to someone is, oh, but don't make such a big deal out of it. It's not that much of an issue. And what I'm hearing from you is that these are normal responses. These are natural things that happen inside of us, and having an understanding of that could support us to hold ourselves with more care and maybe each other with more care.
Yeah, wouldn't it be sweet if the person said to you, would you like a little acknowledgement that you were here first?
Absolutely. I would love that. Thank you for that, actually. Yeah. So I'm also wondering if you could speak a little bit towards the privilege aspect of this, because privilege is such a loaded term. It's something circling every conscious community. And I have a sense that in many of these communities, it becomes the kind of thing we get a bit aggressive about, even when we're in empathic spaces, and perhaps especially because it impacts us so much. So it would be interesting to hear what that end of it is for you and how you bring that in.
There's lots of different research that we'll dive into a little bit at the workshop. But this research shows us that when we get a little bit of power, or when we have a little bit more immunity than other people, by immunity I mean like the way that money makes me immune to having to worry about having my rent paid or my mortgage paid. That's an immunity to economic stress because I have a little more money. Whereas somebody who doesn't have that immunity has more stress in their life. That's a privilege for me. But what we learn with research is that any privilege that I have removes me from connection with others. And I stop having empathy when I have privilege. I lose my empathy buttons. I'm not with people in the same way that I was before. There's very funny, I think this is very funny research. I don't know. Other people don't usually laugh, but that if we have a BMW car, we're less likely to be patient with pedestrians. Just like
sounds familiar. I've been a pedestrian next to a BMW car, and I would say that seems about right.
Watch out for those BMWs. But a part of that is the privilege of having this monster, responsive and expensive, usually, car, and so we lose our empathy. And then if people want to talk about privilege, then there can be like a shame response, like, you don't see me. If you're calling me privileged, you don't see me. You don't see my struggles. I may not be able to pay I may be able to pay my mortgage, but I'm struggling with a child's addiction, you know. And then there's this sense of sort of not quite existing for each other that can be interesting, painful, that we need to learn to kind of have some equanimity with. If we're going to move into trying to change systems, if we get to know what privilege does to us and how to counteract it, then we get to have more choice and we're less reactive.
And I guess less reactive from either end, of the person being called privileged or the person who's offering that evaluation to the other person. Yeah. It's interesting because I have a sense that privilege, I love the connection of the word power with the word privilege. In a way, it really tells me owning my privilege, for example, led me to own the fact that I've had a bit of space and time to work on my own self. And that is privilege. That is privilege because I had love in my life. I had care in my life. And that's sometimes we talk about, we very often talk about money and caste and class, but we don't look at love as, and you know, being raised with love is something that is not a common experience. And holding that for me definitely brought up a little bit of shame, but quite quickly under that was a lot of pain around how painful it is really to look at my fellow human being and know that, okay, you didn't grow up with this love. And it's difficult to take that in. So also kind of wondering about that bit, about the difficulty of seeing people with less than what I have. Partly because when I look at you and you have less, it's hurtful to me because actually I am connected to you. I am impacted by you. And that's incredibly painful.
It is. It's so painful that we often have to begin these workshops with a piece of work that the whole group does, which is with any contracts that we have, not to do harm. So if we have a contract not to do harm or not to partake in systems that do harm, but we live in this world where all of the systems that we know of do harm, and where there is inequality, then that contract, the idea that we will do no harm, that contract stops us from looking. It stops us from being able to see each other, stops us from being able to see the truth of our systems. And once we release that contract, we become much more resilient in the face of seeing what indeed we are enrolled in. How do we have both individual responsibility and systemic responsibility?
It's almost like when you say resilience, for me, it's painting a picture of it grows my capacity to be able to hold what's really true and what's alive right now and what comes to me, no matter how hurtful or difficult it is. I'm hearing you use the word contracts, and I know that I have a little bit of information about that, not having been to any of your courses before. One of the reasons I'm really looking forward to your course is that I get to host you, we get to host you here, and in a way, it's really a major gift for me. I really see that as a perk of my work. But I'm not sure everybody knows about contracts. So would you be willing to say a little bit to speak to what that means when you say that?
Yeah, whenever something bad happens for humans and for other mammals, we write in all of the cues of danger into our amygdala, into the part of the brain that holds traumatic memory. When I was a little girl, we adopted a dog who had been kept by a family where there was domestic violence. And if anybody raised their hand above their shoulder, I mean, even if you were pointing at another person, she would start to bark because it was a sign of danger and she wanted to protect her people. So it's not just humans that write these cues in. We all of us mammals write in the cues of trauma that are alerts for us, like watch out, there may be danger here. And humans have another element because they have more prefrontal cortex than dogs do. And so they write in not just the visual and body position cues that are connected with trauma, they write in the thoughts that they've had that are connected with the trauma, which dogs do not do because they are less cognitive beings than us. But we do. We write these in. If we blame ourselves, we just persist in blaming ourselves. It becomes part of the trauma imprint. If we believe that we are inadequate or bad, or that people cannot be trusted, or if we believe that we don't want to live in a world that's unequal, we won't do it. We will not do harm. Then little kids vow to do no harm. Is like, it was such a beautiful little vow that little children do, but they don't have brains that encompass systems yet. So as we grow, then we still, because the amygdala has no sense of time, just like my little dog barking at us, didn't know it was in a new family where there was no domestic violence, just knew that domestic violence existed and it needed to be protected against. We're doing the same thing. We're in relationship with the past when we're living in the present. And so contract work is a way to work with not just the trauma imprints, which we can also work with, but to also work with to work with the thought patterns that we have written in and begin to learn ways to shift and change them.
I think it answers one of the questions I was going to ask you, which was, who would this be for? Who can come to this workshop? And considering all of us have these beliefs inside of us that either I'm not good enough, or the world is unsafe, or something that really defines my experience on the planet, I would guess the answer is everybody can come to this workshop.
Oh, yes, everybody can come.
Yeah.
Very much looking forward to getting to work with you and your community and with whoever else from around the world may join us.